So now let us start with SA 330, response to the assessed risk. So this standard SA 330 mainly deals with responding to the assessed risk. So in SA 315, we have learned about how the auditor identifies and assesses the risk of metal misstatement. So in this particular standard, the auditor's objective is to respond to the assessed risk. So basically here the objective is to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence about the assessed risk of metal misstatement and to design and implement response towards the assessed risk. So basically here the auditor will respond to the assessed risk by designing and implementing the response. So what is the responsibility of auditor in this particular standard? So as per this standard, the responsibility of auditor is to design and implement response, overall response to address assessed risk of metal misstatement at financial statement level. So basically the auditor needs to design and implement his overall response to address the assessed risk of metal misstatement at the financial statement level. So because the risk is at the financial statement level, he has to design a overall response. The next objective of the auditor is to design and perform further audit procedures. Okay, so to design and perform further audit procedures whose nature, extent and timing is based on the assessed risk of metal misstatement and is also whose nature, extent and timing is responsive towards the assessed risk of metal misstatement. So the auditor shall design and perform further audit procedures whose nature, extent and timing are based on the responsiveness to the assessed risk of metal misstatement at the assertion level. So this is the second objective. So what is the third objective? The third objective is that while the auditor is designing further audit procedure, he should consider the risk of metal misstatement. So basically he has three objectives. The first objective is to design and implement the response, overall response. What is the kind of response? Overall response to address the assessed risk of metal misstatement at the financial statement level. The second thing is to design and perform further audit procedures whose nature, extent and timing is based on and responsive towards assessed risk of metal misstatement. The third responsibility is that while he is designing the further audit procedures, he should consider the risk of metal misstatement. So this is the responsibility of the auditor in this particular standard. Now, in the previous video, in one of my videos, I have discussed about the audit procedures, and audit procedures are broadly divided into risk assessment and further audit procedures. So we've already discussed about risk assessment, and in further audit procedures, there are mainly two types of procedures. The first one is test of control and substantive procedures. So test of control is basically you are testing the internal control, you are testing the operative effectiveness of controls, and substantive procedures is testing the financial statement items mainly. So substantive procedures is again further divided into test of detail and analytical procedures, and test of detail is divided into vouching and verification, which is testing of transactions, that is P&L items, the income and expenditure, and test of balance is about verification of balance sheet items like assets and liabilities. This was about test of details. And substantive procedures, we also read about substantive analytical procedures, where there is evaluation of plausible relationships between financial and non-financial information. So in this chapter, we are mainly going to read about test of control and substantive procedures. So first let us start with test of control. So test of control means we are testing our internal control. So what is the meaning of testing of internal control? So basically, these are nothing but audit procedures which are designed to evaluate the operating effectiveness of controls in preventing, detecting and correcting metal misstatement at assertion level. So how effectively are the controls preventing, detecting and correcting metal misstatements at the assertion level? So this is the meaning of test of controls. So why and when are the test of controls implemented? So basically what happens over here is that the auditor will design and perform test of controls and obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding operative effectiveness of relevant controls. Okay, and this sufficient and appropriate audit evidence should be more persuasive. Okay, so when he is performing these test of controls regarding operating effectiveness of controls, he expects, so basically what does he expect? He expects that the internal control is operating effectively, the controls are operating effectively, and he also thinks that the substantive analytical procedures alone cannot provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence at the assertion levels. So basically, when and why does the auditor perform test of control? So the auditor shall design and perform test of control to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding operating effectiveness of controls when he expects that the controls are operating effectively, and when he thinks that substantive procedures alone cannot provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. That's the reason he is doing test of control. So this is when and why the auditor does test of controls. So Always remember that whenever test of control is included in the auditor's approach, whenever test of control is included in your approach, it means that he can obtain higher assurance on internal control. So basically, higher level of assurance may be sought about the operating effectiveness of controls when the approach adopted mainly consists of test of controls. So the next topic is nature and extent of test of control. So this part is important. So what is the nature and extent of test of controls? So the auditor, while he is designing and performing test of controls, he shall. So basically, when he is designing and performing test of controls, the auditor shall perform other audit procedures in combination with inquiry. So he is performing other audit procedures in combination with inquiry to obtain audit evidence regarding operating effectiveness of controls. So whatever audit evidence that is obtaining regarding operating effectiveness of controls, it includes how the controls are applied at relevant time. So the audit evidence includes how the controls are applied at relevant time, what is the consistency of controls, and by whom and what means were they applied. The second thing that is going to keep in mind while is designing and performing test of controls is that he will determine whether controls to be tested depend on other controls. The controls that is testing, are they dependent on other controls? If no, then the auditor will ignore it. If the controls to be tested depend on other controls, then in that case, the auditor will check, is it necessary to obtain audit evidence supporting the effective operation of the indirect controls? So whatever controls are dependent on the other controls, is it necessary for the auditor? The auditor will check, is it necessary to obtain audit evidence supporting effective operation of indirect controls. So these are the two things which the auditor will keep in mind while he is designing and performing test of controls. The next thing is that inquiry alone is not sufficient to test operating effectiveness of controls. So we've already read that inquiries alone is not sufficient. You need to do inquiry in combination with inspection or re-performance to get more assurance. And one more important point is that whenever you do inquiry with inspection, it will give you less assurance whenever you do inquiry in combination with observation, it will give you less assurance because observation is pertinent only at a point in time in which it is made. So it is pertinent only at a point in time. It is at a point in time in which it is made. So that's the reason it will give less assurance. The next point is that depending upon the type of control, your type of procedure will differ. So your type of control impacts your type of procedure. So the nature of a particular control influences the type of procedure required to obtain audit evidence about whether the control was operating effectively. For example, effectiveness is evidenced by documentation. The auditor may decide to inspect it to obtain audit evidence about operating effectiveness. So if the type of control is documentation, then the type of procedure that the auditor needs to apply is inspection. So depending upon the type of control के हिसाब से आपको अपना procedure लगाना पड़ेगा. Okay, and one more important point is that when more persuasive audit evidence is needed, so you need more persuasive audit evidence regarding the effectiveness of a control, then it may be appropriate to increase the extent of testing of control as well as the degree of reliance on controls. If you need more persuasive audit evidence regarding the controls, then you need to increase your testing of the control and as well as the degree of reliance on the control. So these are the 2 points. Next, we have matters to be considered in determining the extent of control. So what are the matters which you need to consider while determining your extent of control? What is the extent of control? While determining that, what are the matters which you need to consider? The first point is frequency during the period. So the frequency of performance of the control by the entity during the period. How frequently is the entity performing that control during the period? Next, the length of time during the audit period that the auditor is relying on the operative effectiveness. So during the audit period, what is the length of time the auditor is relying on the control? Next, expected rate of deviation from a control. So what is the expected rate of deviation? Relevance and reliability of audit evidence. So what is the relevance and reliability of audit evidence to be obtained regarding the operating effectiveness? So you obtained the audit evidence, but how relevant it is? What is the reliability? Next, the extent to which audit evidence is obtained. So the extent to which audit evidence is obtained from test of other control related to the assertion. The extent to which audit evidence is obtained from test of other control related to assertion. So these are the 5 matters which the auditor needs to keep in mind. Next, the next important part is timing of testing. So do you need to test at a particular time or throughout the period? So basically, what is the timing of testing? You want to test the test of controls. You're doing applying test of controls. Do you need to test at a particular time or throughout the period? So the auditor shall test controls so that he can get appropriate basis for reliance on internal control. So whether to rely on internal control or not, in order to define that, he will test the controls. So when will he test? He will test at a particular time or throughout the period. So it will depend. It will differ. For some controls, evidence only at a point in time is sufficient. But for some controls, evidence over a period is required. So, for example, in case of physical inventory count, evidence up at a point in time is sufficient. You will do physical inventory counting at the end of the year on particular dates, at the end of the month or something like that, at one point in time. Okay, so that will be sufficient. But in case of some control evidence, in case of some controls, evidence over a period of time is required. Like for example, in case of revenue recognition, the test of control may include test of entities, monitoring of controls. How is the entity monitoring? You need to test it over a period of time, throughout the period. Okay, so the timing of testing will differ depending upon the type of control. Next, the auditor can plan the testing to cover all important areas over a period of 3 years. So you can plan the testing to cover all important areas over a period of 3 years. The next important topic is using audit evidence obtained in previous audit regarding test of controls. So basically, when the auditor was doing his previous audit, he has obtained some evidence. Can the auditor use that audit evidence now? So basically, whether it is appropriate or not to use the previous audit's audit evidence relating to test of control. So if it is considered as appropriate, if the auditor considers appropriate, yes, I can use the previous year audit evidence right now. Then the auditor will decide the length of time period that may elapse before retesting the control. So what is the length of time period that is valid for which you can use the previous audit evidence? And for this, the auditor has to consider different factors. So depending upon the factors, the length of time period for using the previous year audit evidence regarding test of control will differ. So these factors are tested in a previous year exam for 4 marks. So this topic is important. So what are the factors that the auditor will consider to decide the length of time before retesting the control? So first and foremost, factor that it will control is the effectiveness of other elements in internal control. So basically, in the internal control part, we have read about the components or elements of internal control, for which the abbreviation is CRIME, which is control environment, then risk assessment process, then information system, then monitoring of controls and control activities. So basically, what is the effectiveness of the elements in internal control? What is the effectiveness of the control environment? What is the effectiveness of the monitoring of controls? What is the effectiveness of the risk assessment process? What is the effectiveness of general IT control? So the auditor needs to check the effectiveness of the elements of internal control basically. So we have an example of general IT control. So if you take a look, if Infosys has strong general IT controls, Deloitte India is the auditor. So Deloitte India might rely more on the audit evidence from previous audits for IT-related controls. For IT-related controls, it might rely more on the previous audit evidence. So that is the meaning. So what is the effectiveness of your internal control elements? Next, risk from characteristics of control. So what is the characteristics of the control? Is the characteristic manual or it is automated? What is the characteristic of the control? So if the controls are manual, then in that case they are more prone to error. So in that case, you cannot use the previous audit evidence regarding the test of control. If it is automated, then to some extent you can use, but if it is manual, it means that it is more prone to error. The next one is past deviation. So you need to examine the deviations noted in the previous audit to determine if they were significant. So if there were any deviations that you have noted in your previous audit, then check whether they are significant or not. So if they are significant, then check if there have been changes in personnel that might affect the control. So you have to check whether the deviations, if there are any, whether they were significant. Then you have to check whether there were any changes in personnel that might affect the control. So any past deviations also the auditor need to consider. The next point is risk due to lack of change. So sometimes what happens is that the controls remain unchanged, they just remain the same from the previous audit to this audit, but because of that there might be some risk. So because of the unchanged controls, the controls are unchanged but the environment is changing constantly, then what is the risk due to lack of change of the controls? So evaluate the impact of unchanged controls in a changing environment. Next, risk of material misstatement. So assess the risk of material misstatement associated with the control and how much the auditor relies on it. So if you want to use the evidence of the previous audit regarding the controls, then check what is the risk of material misstatement that is associated with the control and how much the auditor relies on it. For example, if risk of material misstatement for revenue recognition is high at Tata Consultancy Services, then XY India, that is basically the auditor, he may decide to retest those controls sooner. Lastly, re-establish relevance of evidence. So whatever previous audit evidence, is it relevant or not for you to use right now? So obtain evidence about any significant changes that have occurred since the previous audit to ensure whether you can continue to rely on the past evidence. So this was about whether the auditor can use the past evidence or not, what factors should he consider in order to determine whether he can use or not when does he have to retest. The next point is, see, once you have performed test of controls, you will obviously get a result from them. You have tested it, you will get a result. So the auditor will decide based on the results of the test of control whether the internal control is designed, implemented and operating effectively. Depending upon the results of the test of control, he will design whether internal control is operating effectively or not, as contemplated during the risk assessment. So during the risk assessment, he will carefully consider the controls, and after test of controls, he will actually know whether they are designed, implemented or operating effectively or not. So next, the auditor will evaluate any deviation. So basically, he will evaluate the deviations which might result in revision of risk of material misstatement, change in nature and extent of substantive procedures. So basically, when the auditor will evaluate the deviations might result in revision of risk of material misstatement and change in nature, extent and timing of substantive procedures. So because of the deviation, the risk of material misstatement needs to be revised. Because of the deviation, your substantive procedures, the nature, extent and timing of your substantive procedures may also need to be revised. So what will happen? There might be a change in nature and extent of substantive procedures. So during the substantive procedures, the auditor will check detected misstatements, if any, which suggest control ineffectiveness. So he will check whether the detected misstatements, if any, suggest control ineffectiveness. Because of the detected misstatement, the detected misstatement is suggesting that the controls are operating ineffectively. If there is no misstatement found during substantive testing, it does not automatically prove control effectiveness. Just because you didn't find any misstatement during the audit, it does not mean that your controls are completely effective. No. Even if you don't find any evidence, it does not prove that the controls are effective. Next, finding a material misstatement usually points to a significant control deficiency. So basically, when you find a material misstatement, it will point to a significant deficiency in internal control as per SA 265, which will later need to communicate to TC level chair management as per SA 265. So the next topic is specific inquiries by auditor when deviations from controls are detected. So what is happening over here is that the auditor, he wants to rely on the internal control, but what happens? He found some deviations. So because of the deviations, what will the auditor do? Will he still rely or not? So when the auditor finds a deviation in the internal control, on which he intends to rely, then the auditor will do specific inquiries. So what are the specific inquiries which the auditor will do? First and foremost thing, he will try to understand the matters. He will try to understand the potential consequence of the deviation. What are the matters which are causing the deviation? What is the potential consequence of the deviation? After doing the specific inquiries, the auditor will determine whether the test of controls provide an appropriate basis for reliance of control. So depending when you have done the test of controls, do they actually provide an appropriate basis for reliance on control, and whether additional test of control is required. You have done the test of control, do they provide appropriate basis for reliance on control? Check. Whether additional test of control is required? Check. And the potential risk of middle misstatement needs to be addressed using substantive procedures also you need to check. So we need to check test of control, provide a appropriate basis for reliance, whether you need to do additional test of control, and whether the risk of middle misstatement will need substantive procedures or not. So next, let us come to substantive procedures. Substantive procedures mainly includes test of detail and substantive analytical procedures. So you already read about substantive analytical procedures, SA 520. Okay, so substantive analytical procedures, same thing. So basically, it is the evaluation of financial and non-financial information, the plausible relationship between financial and non-financial information, and it also includes investigation of identified fluctuations, inconsistent relationships, and other relevant information that is deviating significantly from the predicted amounts. Next one is test of detail. So test of detail, what will the auditor do? The auditor will check assertions. What assertions will he check? He will check assertions related to transactions, account balances, and presentation and disclosure. In case of transactions, he is going to check the occurrence, the completeness, the accuracy of the amount, the classification of the account, in which account is it classified correctly or not, the cutoff, in which to which period it relates. So basically, he is going to check OCACC. In case of presentation of disclosure, he is going to check OCCA. He is going to check the occurrence and rights and obligations, the completeness, the classification, again the accuracy and the valuation. And in case of account balance, they are going to check the existence, the rights and obligations, the completeness, and also the valuation allocations. This was about test of details. So basically, while designing and performing substantive procedures, so substantive procedures includes test of detail and substantive analytical procedures. So auditor will determine whether he needs to do only substantive procedures or only test of details, or he needs to apply a combination of both. Only substantive procedures, only test of details, or combination of both. Now, if the results of test of controls are unsatisfactory, then what will happen? The auditor has done test of control. The result is unsatisfactory. Then he will increase his substantive procedures. He will increase his substantive analytical procedures more. He will do more checking later on because the test of controls are unsatisfactory. So we have completed up until here. Next important concept is internal financial control and internal control over financial reporting. So we have already discussed this in SA 610. So let's keep it short. So internal financial control is nothing but the policies and procedures which the company puts to ensure these 5 things: the reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, compliance with law and regulation, safeguarding of assets, and prevent detection and correction of fraud. Internal control over financial reporting is nothing but that the auditor expresses opinion on effectiveness of entities' internal control over financial reporting. This is basically the auditor's opinion on the effectiveness of entities' internal control. So this is narrow and this is wide. These are basically broad policies and these are specific controls. So there's an MCQ over which you can refer. So the important part over here is that Companies Act has given a few areas where internal financial control is important. So Companies Act has placed greater emphasis on effective implementation and reporting on internal controls for a company. The term internal financial control is used at some place in the Companies Act, casting responsibilities as under. So basically, as per the relevant provisions, so these are the relevant provisions, as per the relevant provisions, as per section 134 clause 5 clause E, in case of listed companies, the director's responsibility statement shall state the directors had laid on internal financial controls. So basically, the director's responsibility statement shall state that the directors have laid on internal financial controls to be followed by the company. Next, in case of the auditor's report, there also should need to state that adequate internal financial controls have been complied with. But see, however, this requirement, it does not apply to private company which is an OPC or a small company and whose turnover is less than 50 crores, or it does not apply to OPC, it does not apply to small company, it does not apply to a company whose turnover is less than 50 crores as per the latest audited financial statements, turnover is less than 50 crores, and also its aggregate borrowings, the total borrowings from banks or financial institutions or any body corporate at any point, which has aggregate borrowings from banks or financial institutions, any body corporate or at any point, less than 25 crores. So its aggregate borrowings from banks or financial institutions is also less than 25 crores. So that for these cases, internal financial control does not apply. So this can be asked in the form of a question where adequate internal financial controls need not apply, to which private companies that internal financial control requirement does not apply. This can be tested. Next, section 174 the act. Every audit committee shall act in accordance with the term of reference specified in writing. Evaluation of internal financial controls and risk management systems. So company and independent actors survive the provisions released as per the code role and function of sciences. Financial controls and risk management are robust and defensive. So basically here the company's act is telling. So in this you can remember the first 2 points. These are important. The rest 2 points are not that important. Okay. So basically the directors and the management have primary responsibility of implementing and maintaining effective internal control framework, and audit is expected to evaluate, validate and report. Okay. So this point is important. This line. Directors and management are responsible for internal financial controls. Auditors are responsible for evaluating, validating and reporting on the design and operating effectiveness of internal financial controls. That's it. Lastly, we have documentation of risk. So what do you need to document? First thing, discussion among engagement team and significant decisions reached. So basically when you do the audit, you will have an engagement team. What did you discuss with your engagement team, and what are the significant decisions that you have taken with the team? This thing you need to document. The next thing is key elements of understanding obtained regarding each aspect of the entity and its environment. So what are the key elements of understanding? What are the key elements of understanding which you have obtained regarding each aspect of the entity and its environment? What did you understand regarding each aspect of the entity and also its environment? The third thing that you need to document is the identified and assessed risk of meeting misstatement, both at the financial statement level and assertion level. And the last thing is the risk identified and related controls. 4 things. What did you discuss with the engagement team? What are the significant decisions that you reached to it? What are the key elements regarding understanding, key elements of understanding which you obtained regarding aspects of entity and the environment? Identify and assess risk of meeting misstatement at both financial statement level and assertion level, and whatever risk that you identified and related controls. That's it. So we're done with essay 330 as well.